The wind was a godless thing. It came down from the northern peaks without apology, a blade of pure cold that scoured the plains and stripped the cottonwoods bare. For Elias Cade, the sound was a familiar hymn of solitude. It rattled the single window of his cabin and found the cracks in the mud chinking, whispering of a world that had long ago frozen over. His world. Anyway, he stood at that window, a thick slab of a man built of shoulders and silence, and watched the snow begin to fall. It was not the gentle, promising snow of early winter, but the hard, stinging kind that meant business. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the horizon had vanished. He was a man marooned on a sea of white, and he preferred it that way. The cabin was spare, furnished with the ghosts of a life that was no longer his. A rocking chair by the hearth that his wife, Martha, had favored. A small, crudely carved horse on the mantelpiece. The last thing he had made for his boy, Samuel. 5 years. 5 years since the fever had taken them both in the space of a week, leaving him with nothing but the howl of the wind for company. He had buried them himself, on the little rise behind the cabin, and then he had buried his heart right alongside them. People in the town of Redemption, a day's ride east, kept their distance. They knew of his loss. They also whispered of his past. Before Martha, before the ranch. There were rumors of a gun belt worn low and a reputation earned in bloodier territories. He never spoke of it, and his eyes, the color of a winter creek, gave nothing away. They saw only a man who moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, whose hands were calloused and capable, and whose voice, when he used it, was rough from disuse, like a rusty hinge. He turned from the window and threw another log onto the fire. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He was settling in for the long siege of winter, a battle he fought and won every year. He had enough wood, enough salted meat and flour. He had his silence. It was all he needed. A sudden, frantic pounding on the door shattered the quiet. Elias froze. No one came out this far, not in this weather. The sound was thin and desperate against the roar of the wind. He grabbed the Spencer rifle leaning against the wall, his movements fluid and economical, a ghost of another man's instincts. He cracked the door open a few inches, the rifle held low and ready. A figure stood on his porch, small and dark against the swirling white. It was a woman, or rather a girl, wrapped in a threadbare coat, a cheap bonnet doing little to shield her face from the biting snow. Her eyes were wide with a terror that seemed to startle her own soul, and she trembled so fiercely he could see it from across the threshold.
"Mr. Cade?"
she stammered, her voice barely a whisper.
"Elias Cade?"
He said nothing, just stared at her, his face a mask of stone.
I was sent,"
she said, her teeth chattering.
"From Ohio. Your cousin, Jedediah. He arranged it."
The name landed on him like a physical blow. Jedediah, his fool of a cousin, who he had not seen in a decade, the one who always had a scheme. "Jedediah's dead," Elias said, his voice flat.
"Died of a cough 2 months back."
The girl's face, already pale, turned ashen. The last flicker of hope in her eyes seemed to gutter and die.
Oh, no, he paid my passage. He said you were waiting for a bride."
Bride. The word was an obscenity in the hallowed silence of his cabin. He felt a surge of hot, angry guilt. Jedediah, the damn fool, had sent this child into the jaws of winter to a dead man's life without a word of warning. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "There's nothing for you here. You need to go back to town. The stagecoach driver who brought you can take you back."
"He left me,"
she whispered, her gaze falling to the worn toes of her boots.
"Said his job was done. My stepfather, he won't take me back.
She swallowed hard, a tremor running through her small frame. "He was going to sell my contract to a man from the mills." Elias saw it then. This was not a girl seeking a husband. This was a rabbit fleeing a trap. She was barely 19, he reckoned, with a face that had not yet learned how to hide what was in her heart. He saw the innocence there, fragile as a robin's egg, and the raw fear of a creature that had been hunted. Something inside him, a cold, hard knot he had mistaken for dead, twisted. "This ain't no place for you," he repeated, but the conviction was draining from his voice. The wind howled, pushing the door against his hand, as if the storm itself wanted her inside. He could not send her out into that, not even a dog. With a sigh that felt like it was dredged up from the bottom of his soul, he pulled the door open wider. "Get in before you freeze solid." She scurried past him, bringing a chill and the scent of snow into the warmth of the cabin. She stood near the door, dripping onto the floorboards, clutching a small, battered valise to her chest as if it were a shield. She looked at the bare room, the single cot, the stone hearth, her eyes taking in the stark loneliness of his existence. "My name is Clara May," she said softly, as if an introduction might somehow mend the broken situation. Elias just grunted and shut the door, bolting it against the storm. The world outside disappeared, leaving them trapped in the small, charged space. The silence that descended was heavier than before, thick with everything that was unsaid. He felt her gaze on him as he moved about the cabin, and it was like the weight of a feather, barely there but impossible to ignore. He was acutely aware of his size, of the rough timbre of his voice, of the very air he displaced. He felt like a bear trapped in a dollhouse. He gestured toward the fire. "Get warm, I'll make coffee." For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. They moved around each other in a state of awkward truce, the silence broken only by the necessities of survival. He taught her how to bank the fire at night and how to grind the coffee beans. She, in turn, took over the cooking, her movements tentative at first, then more confident. She made biscuits that were surprisingly light, and a stew from his salted pork that was more flavorful than anything he had eaten in years. He watched her when he thought she was not looking. He noticed the way her hands, though chapped and red from the cold, were gentle as she kneaded dough. He saw the blush that stained her cheeks when he came in from the barn, his chest bare as he washed the cold and sweat from his skin at the basin. She would turn away quickly, her focus suddenly intent on a loose thread on her sleeve or a spot on the floor. It was an innocence so profound it almost felt like a reproach. It stirred something in him, a protective instinct he thought had been buried with his son. He felt a powerful, unsettling urge to shield her from men like him, from the harshness of the world that had already bruised her. He tried to send her away in his mind a dozen times. As soon as the snow cleared, he would take her to town, give her what little money he had, and put her on the first stage heading east. It was the right thing to do, the decent thing. But with each passing day, her quiet presence began to fill the empty corners of the cabin, and of his heart. The thought of the silence returning felt less like peace and more like a punishment. On the 4th evening, the blizzard finally broke. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and a sliver of moon shone through a break in the clouds, illuminating a world transformed, buried in a blanket of pristine, blue-tinted white. The silence in the cabin felt different now, less tense. Clara sat in the rocking chair, mending one of his shirts by the firelight. The needle moved deftly in her fingers. She looked up and caught him watching her. For the first time, she did not look away immediately. "Jedediah said you were a good man," she said, her voice soft. "He said you were lonely." Elias looked into the fire, his jaw tight. Jedediah was a fool who talked too much. "He was kind to me," she insisted gently. "He saw that I was unhappy. He wanted to help." "By sending a lamb to a wolf?" The words were out before he could stop them, rough and full of self-loathing. Her eyes widened slightly, but there was no fear in them, only a deep, swimming sadness.
"Are you a wolf, Mr. Cade?" He had no answer for that. He did not know what he was anymore. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a vessel filled with nothing but memory and silence. Before he could conjure a response, another sound cut through the night. It was faint at first, a desperate, rhythmic thudding, almost lost in the deep snow. It sounded like a horse being pushed too hard, its hooves muffled by the drifts. Elias was on his feet in an instant, the rifle once again in his hand. He moved to the door, listening. The sound grew louder, closer. It was a horse, and it was in trouble. He heard a pained whinny, then a heavy, sickening crash. He threw the bolt and wrenched the door open. The cold air hit him like a fist. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the snow. Not 30 yards from his cabin, a horse had fallen, its leg bent at an unnatural angle. A figure was struggling to pull itself free from the saddle, a dark shape against the snow. Without a thought, he plunged into the waist-deep powder, the cold biting at his legs. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her face a pale oval of alarm. As he got closer, he saw it was another woman. She was soaked through, not with snow, but with freezing rain. The blizzard had broken, but a cruel, icy downpour had followed it. She managed to free herself from the fallen horse and took 2 stumbling steps toward the cabin's light before her legs gave out. She collapsed into the snow, a heap of wet wool and exhaustion. He reached her in a few long strides and knelt, rolling her gently onto her back. Her face was pale and drawn in the moonlight, framed by strands of dark, wet hair. She was older than Clara, maybe in her early 30s, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a second, they focused on him. They were the color of a gathering storm, filled with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. Then they rolled back in her head, and she went limp. He scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but dense with the cold. As he lifted her, her coat fell open, and in the stark moonlight, he saw the dark, ugly bruises blooming across her ribs, stark and violet against the pale skin of her chemise. He carried her back to the cabin, his boots sinking deep with every step. Clara held the door open, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity. He laid the unconscious woman down on the floor near the hearth, on the bearskin rug that was the cabin's only luxury. "Get some blankets," he ordered Clara, his voice tight. "And heat some water. We need to get these wet clothes off her." Clara flew to the task, her earlier timidity replaced by a quiet efficiency. Elias worked on the woman's boots, his fingers struggling with the frozen leather. He finally managed to pull them off, revealing feet that were numb and white with cold. He began to chafe them between his rough palms, trying to bring life back into them. Clara returned with the blankets and a basin of steaming water. There was a moment of hesitation. A silent question passed between them. Elias understood. He was a man, and this was a stranger. But decency had its limits when a life was at stake. "You do it," he said, his voice low. "I'll go see to her horse." It was a lie. He knew the horse's leg was broken. He was just giving them both a measure of privacy. He took his rifle and went back outside. A single, sharp crack echoed in the frigid air a moment later. When he returned, he did not have to pretend. The grimness on his face was real. Clara had managed to peel away the woman's soaked dress and chemise and had wrapped her tightly in 2 thick wool blankets. The woman's clothes lay in a sodden heap, and the firelight flickered over the ugly map of bruises on her skin. Clara was bathing her forehead with a warm cloth, her expression a mixture of concentration and dismay. "She's burning with fever," Clara whispered. Elias knelt beside her. He touched the woman's neck. She was hot to the touch, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. He had seen this before. He knew the signs. For the next 2 days, the cabin became a sick room. The woman, whose name they found on a letter in her saddlebag, Lorna Beckett, drifted in and out of consciousness. In her delirium, she cried out, fragments of sentences filled with fear and pleading. "No, please, I didn't mean it. The fire." Elias and Clara worked together, a silent, efficient team. He brewed willow bark tea to fight the fever. He held Lorna down when her thrashing threatened to throw her from the cot where they had moved her. Clara bathed her, fed her broth when she could swallow, and spoke to her in low, soothing tones. During this time, a subtle shift occurred. Clara was no longer just a guest, a problem to be solved. She was a partner. She watched Elias, her gaze filled with a cautious curiosity. She saw the gentleness in his large, rough hands as he tended to the sick woman. She saw the weariness in his eyes that spoke of old, familiar grief. She was wary of Lorna, of the violent sorrow that seemed to cling to her like a shroud, but she was not unkind. Elias, for his part, tried to remain distant, to retreat back into the fortress of his silence. But it was impossible. He was now sharing his small, isolated world with two women. One was a spring shoot, tender and green, reaching for the sun. The other was a storm-bent tree, scarred and battered but still standing. Clara's blushing innocence and Lorna's haunted strength began to chip away at the ice around his heart. He felt the thaw, and it terrified him. The silence of his cabin was gone, replaced by the sound of two different women breathing in the dark, and he was no longer sure if he was the wolf, or if he was the one trapped between them. The fever broke, but the chill remained. Lorna Beckett recovered slowly, like a patch of frozen ground thawing under a reluctant spring sun. She moved about the cabin with a weary grace, her storm-colored eyes missing nothing. A fragile peace settled over the small household, a quiet so thin it felt as if a single sharp word could shatter it. They existed in a delicate, unspoken choreography of chores and meals, each person a fixed point in a triangle of tension. Lorna's story came out not in a flood, but in fragments, like pieces of a broken pot. One evening, as she stared into the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, she spoke without preamble. "My husband was a man of God," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He preached forgiveness on Sunday and practiced damnation the rest of the week." Clara, who was darning a sock, stopped her work, her needle poised in midair. Elias, sharpening a knife by the hearth, did not look up, but the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel ceased. "He believed a woman's soul was a wicked, tangled thing," Lorna continued, her gaze locked on the flames, "and that it was his sacred duty to beat the sin out of it. He was very diligent in his work." She took a sip of tea, her hand steady. "The fire was a surprise. The whole town was at a barn raising. The house went up so fast. They found him in the study, a bottle of communion wine beside him." She finally looked up, her eyes finding Elias's in the dim light. "Some folks think I locked the door from the outside." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the confession. Clara's face was a portrait of shocked pity. Elias's expression remained unreadable, his face carved from shadow and stone. He felt a cold knot of uncertainty in his gut. He had seen the bruises, he had heard the terror in her delirious cries, but he had also known men and women who could lie as easily as they breathed. A week later, when the path to town was finally clear enough for a wagon, Elias decided they needed supplies. The thought of leaving them alone felt wrong, and the thought of taking them felt like courting trouble. He chose the latter. The town of Redemption was a small, hard place, and gossip was its primary currency. As they walked into the general store, a hush fell over the handful of customers. Eyes followed them, lingering on Lorna with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, then flicking to Clara, then to Elias, piecing together a story that was far more scandalous than the truth. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in disapproval, served them with pursed lips as she weighed out a bag of flour.
A man loafing by the stove spoke loudly to his companion. "Looks like Cade's collecting strays. Wonder what kind of work they do for their keep." Elias's whole body went rigid. His hand, resting on the counter, slowly curled into a fist. Before he could speak, Clara stepped forward, her chin high.
Mrs. Beckett was ill, sir,
she said, her voice clear and trembling only slightly.
And Mr. Cade was good enough to offer her shelter from the storm, as he did for me. It is a Christian kindness I'm sure a town like this understands.
The man, taken aback by her directness, just grunted and looked away. Mrs. Gable slammed the flour onto the counter. The air was thick with judgment. Lorna, who had stood silent and impassive through the exchange, gave Clara a brief, unreadable glance. On the ride back to the ranch, no one spoke a word, but Elias felt a grudging respect for the girl. There was steel in her, buried deep beneath the shyness. He also felt a rising tide of protectiveness, a grim, possessive anger that startled him. Let them whisper. These women were under his roof. They were his to protect. In the weeks that followed, Clara blossomed under the vast, open sky. She had a hunger to be useful. Elias taught her to saddle a horse, his large, calloused hands guiding her smaller, softer ones on the leather straps. He felt the jolt of her touch, a warmth that spread up his arm and settled in his chest. He showed her how to milk their lone cow, how to mend a split fence rail, how to read the clouds for signs of weather. He found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining the rhythms of the land, the logic of the seasons. He saw how she listened, her blue eyes wide and serious, her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed the way the sun brought out threads of gold in her brown hair and the spray of freckles across her nose. She was gentle, yet determined, and her quiet hopefulness was a balm on the raw wound of his solitude. Lorna watched them. She saw the way Elias's gaze softened when he looked at Clara. She saw the blush that rose on Clara's cheeks when he spoke to her. She saw in the girl a reflection of a self she could barely remember, a version of womanhood that had been stolen from her before it ever had a chance to bloom. There was no malice in her observation, only a profound, aching melancholy. She was the winter, and Clara was the spring, and Elias was the hard, unforgiving land caught between them. One night, a full moon hung in the sky, bathing the snow-covered landscape in a ghostly silver light. Lorna had gone outside, seeking a moment of peace, leaving Elias and Clara alone in the cabin. The fire crackled, the only sound in the warm, intimate space. Clara sat on the small stool she favored, her hands clasped in her lap. She had been quiet all evening, a nervous energy humming around her. Finally, she looked at him, her expression earnest and vulnerable.
Mr. Cade,
she began, her voice barely above a whisper.
Am I enough?
He frowned, not understanding. Enough for what?
To be a wife,
she said, the words coming out in a rush.
I know how to cook and clean. I can learn the work of the ranch. I would try to be a good wife to you.
His breath caught in his throat. He saw the hope in her eyes, pure and terrifying. Before he could form a reply, she stood up and crossed the small space between them. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his forearm. Her touch was hesitant, yet electric.
Clara,
he started, his voice a rough rasp. She leaned in, her face tilted up to his, her lips slightly parted. He could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wood smoke on her. He saw the trust in her eyes, the innocent offering of herself, and a wave of something akin to panic washed over him. He was a broken thing, a man full of jagged edges. He would shatter her. He pulled his arm back as if her touch had burned him. "Don't," he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. The light in her eyes died. Her hand fell to her side, and a deep, painful blush flooded her face. She looked down at the floor, shame radiating from her in waves.
I'm sorry,
she mumbled.
I didn't mean to be so forward. She turned and practically fled to the small cot in the corner that was hers, pulling the blanket up to her chin and turning her back to him. Elias stood by the fire, his heart pounding a heavy, guilty rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a monster. He had not pulled away from disgust, but from a fierce, desperate need to protect her from the darkness within himself. He was afraid to ruin her. The next afternoon, he was in the barn, splitting wood, working off the restless energy that had plagued him since his exchange with Clara. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a comfort, a simple, mindless task. Lorna appeared in the wide doorway, a silhouette against the bright, cold day. "She cried herself to sleep last night," she said, her voice calm and direct. Elias did not stop his work. He brought the axe down hard, splitting a log cleanly in two. "That's not my concern." "Is it not?" Lorna stepped into the barn, the scent of hay and dust swirling around her. "You have 2 women under your roof. Elias, one you treat like a porcelain doll you're afraid to break. And the other—" She trailed off, her eyes sweeping over him, taking in the sweat on his brow, the powerful flex of his muscles. "The other you look at like she's already shattered, so it does not matter how you handle the pieces." He stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He turned to face her. "What do you want, Lorna?" "I want you to be honest," she said, her voice low and intense. "With yourself. You look at her and see a saint. You look at me and see a sinner. A woman who knows pain, who is not afraid of the dark. A woman you think you can touch without leaving a mark, because she is already scarred." She took a step closer, her stormy eyes boring into his. "You cannot love her like a saint and me like a sinner. You have to choose who you are, a guardian or a man." Her words struck him like a physical blow, laying bare the truth he had refused to confront. He was a coward, hiding behind his grief and their perceived fragility. He saw the hunger in her eyes, a reflection of the same desperate loneliness that clawed at his own soul. It was not the gentle hope he saw in Clara. It was a raw, aching need for oblivion, for a moment of feeling something other than pain. The sky, which had been clear, began to darken as a sudden storm rolled in from the mountains. A cold wind rattled the barn doors, and the first drops of a freezing rain began to fall. Tapping against the roof, the world outside grew dim. In the charged silence of the barn, Lorna closed the remaining distance between them. She reached up and laid her hand on his cheek. Her palm was cool, her touch firm. "Stop hiding, Elias," she whispered. He did not know who moved first. It was a mutual surrender, a collapsing of walls that had stood for too long. His arms went around her, pulling her against him, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was not tender. It was a collision, a storm of desperate physical need. It tasted of salt and sorrow, and a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. This was not about love. It was about release. Her fingers dug into his back, her body pressing against his, seeking friction, seeking to be held so tightly that the broken pieces of her might feel whole for a moment. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of rain and woman, a scent that was achingly alive. He was a man starved, and she was a feast. He lifted her and carried her to the soft hay in an empty stall, the rain now drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof above them. They came together in a tangle of limbs and whispered needs, a desperate act of forgetting. For him, it was a release from the crushing weight of his ghosts. For her, it was a defiant cry against the memory of cruel hands and a cold bed. It was a fire meant to burn away the past, if only for an hour. From the shadows near the entrance of the barn, Clara watched. She had come to fetch the milk pail, her heart a tangle of apology and hope, wanting to make things right after the previous night. The sight before her stopped her breath. She saw the raw, desperate motion in the hay, heard Lorna's sharp, breathy cry. It was not the tender union she had imagined in her most secret dreams. It was something fierce, animal, and painful to watch. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of the fragile, unspoken thing that had been growing between herself and Elias. A sob caught in her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. She turned and fled, not back to the cabin, but out into the growing storm, into the cold, cleansing rain and snow. She ran without thought, her only instinct to put distance between herself and the image seared into her mind. It was nearly an hour later when Elias, his senses returning to him, realized Clara was gone. A cold dread, far deeper than the chill of the storm, seized him. He pulled on his coat and plunged into the maelstrom, shouting her name until his throat was raw. He found her huddled at the base of a large pine tree, her dress soaked through, her body shivering uncontrollably. She was pale and still, her eyes closed, nearly frozen. He swept her into his arms and carried her back to the cabin. Lorna was there, her face pale and her expression grim. Together, they stripped off Clara's wet clothes and wrapped her in every blanket they had. Elias held her close, rubbing her hands and feet, trying to force his own warmth into her frigid body. Slowly, she revived. The shivering subsided, and color returned to her cheeks. She opened her eyes and looked at him. There were no tears, only a vast, empty hurt. Lorna quietly slipped out of the cabin, leaving them alone. In the quiet after the storm, with only the sound of the crackling fire, he held her. She felt small and fragile in his arms. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I didn't know it would hurt like that, to see, but I still want you." Her words were a knife in his gut. He had not only broken her heart, he had corrupted her innocence with a truth she was not ready for. He held her tighter, a silent, wretched apology. He was a man torn. One woman, a tender shoot, needed to be cherished and protected from the frost. The other, a storm-tossed tree, needed to be burned, to feel a fire that could match the one raging inside her. And God help him, he needed them both. One stirred his soul. The other stirred his blood. Both, he was beginning to realize, were essential to him. Two halves of a whole he never knew he was missing. Spring did not arrive with grace. It came violently, in a torrent of melting snow that turned the land into a sea of mud. The creeks swelled, and the air, though warmer, carried the damp, raw scent of rebirth and decay. Inside the small cabin, a similar, uneasy thaw was taking place. The sharp edges of their shared trauma had been worn down by proximity, replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. They moved around each other with a practiced familiarity, a household of three strangers bound by a storm and the unspoken complexities of the heart. Elias, Clara, and Lorna existed in a fragile equilibrium, but the world outside their isolated patch of land was not content to leave them in peace. When Elias next went to town for seed and salt, the chill he received had nothing to do with the weather. Men who had once nodded to him now stared at the ground as he passed. Women gathered their skirts and whispered behind their hands. The word had spread, carried on the wind like a sickness, twisting the story of their survival into something ugly and unnatural. He heard the whispers as he passed the saloon. Lorna was the Black Widow, the witch who had burned her own husband in his bed. Clara was the young harlot, sold into a life of sin. And he, Elias Cade, was the depraved beast who kept them both, a man living in defiance of God and law. The looks he received were a mixture of revulsion and a dark, prurient curiosity. Redemption, it seemed, was a town that lived up to its name only in signboard letters. The judgment followed them home. One Sunday, the circuit preacher, a severe man with eyes like chips of flint, delivered a sermon that left little to the imagination. Standing on a makeshift pulpit in the town square, he thundered against the unholy unions and dens of iniquity that festered in the shadows, poisoning the community with their rot. He did not need to name them. Every soul in attendance knew who he was talking about. The weight of the town's scorn settled on the cabin. An invisible but palpable pressure. To fight it, Elias began to build. He felled 2 tall pines from the stand behind the house and began hewing them into logs. He was adding a room onto the cabin. A small, separate space. In his mind, it was for Clara. A place for her to have privacy. A door she could close. It was a wall to keep him decent. A physical boundary to protect her from the chaos of his own desires and the complexities of his connection to Lorna. But Lorna did not see a sanctuary. She saw a different kind of wall. She watched him from the porch, her arms crossed, as he worked with a furious, single-minded energy. She saw the sweat on his back, the strain of his muscles as he lifted the heavy logs. She saw a man building a cage for his saint, while his sinner was left to wander the main room. She saw a line being drawn in the dirt between them, a choice being made in timber and nails. She said nothing, but a new, cold distance entered her eyes. Clara, however, seemed to find her footing in the midst of the turmoil. The timid girl who had arrived in a blizzard was slowly being replaced by a young woman of quiet strength. The ranch became her world, and she moved through it with a growing sense of purpose. She learned the names of the wildflowers that poked through the last of the snow. She found a strange comfort in the repetitive, honest work of their days, churning butter, mending clothes, tending to the small vegetable patch they had planted. An unspoken alliance began to form between the 2 women. They worked together in the cabin, their shared tasks creating a rhythm that was almost peaceful. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch snapping beans into a large wooden bowl, a comfortable silence settled between them. "He is a good man," Clara said suddenly, her voice soft. Lorna did not look up from her work. "He is a man," she replied, her tone flat. "That is a more complicated thing." Clara hesitated, her fingers stilling on a bean pod. I know what I saw. In the barn." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and honest. "I do not understand it, but I do not hate you for it." Lorna finally looked at her. Her gaze was direct, stripped of all pretense. "What he and I had in that barn was not about goodness. It was about 2 people trying not to drown. Sometimes, you just grab for the nearest thing that floats." Clara absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. A few moments passed. "Lorna?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What should it feel like, with a man?" Lorna's hand stilled. She looked out at the vast expanse of the valley, at the mountains that stood like silent, ancient witnesses. A flicker of some old, deep pain crossed her face before she masked it. When she spoke, her voice was low and rough with memory. "It should not feel like a debt being paid," she said. "It should not feel like a duty, or a chore, or a punishment. It should not make you feel small, or ashamed." She turned her stormy eyes to Clara, and for the first time, Clara saw not a rival, but a survivor. It should feel like coming home, even if you have never been there before. It should feel like you are safe, even if the whole world is burning down around you. It should be a quiet thing, a warmth. Anything else is just noise. The conversation changed something between them. Clara began to see the scars Lorna carried, not just the faded bruises on her skin, but the deeper ones on her soul. And Lorna, in turn, began to see past Clara's innocence to the resilient, brave heart beating beneath it. They were 2 different kinds of broken, but they were beginning to recognize the same sorrow in each other's eyes. The simmering tension with the town finally boiled over one evening at dusk. They were sitting down to a dinner of rabbit stew when a horseman appeared at the edge of their property. It was Walt Blevins, a local trapper with a mean streak and a powerful thirst. He was drunk, swaying in his saddle, a half-empty bottle clutched in his hand. "Cade," he bellowed, his voice slurring. "Come on out, or are you too busy with your whores to face a real man?" Elias was on his feet in an instant, his face a thundercloud. "Stay inside," he said to the women. his voice a low growl. He walked out onto the porch, shutting the cabin door firmly behind him. "You got no business here, Walt," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "Right on." Blevins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I just wanted a closer look at the happy family, the witch, the virgin, and the old gunslinger playing house. Tell me, Cade, do you take them one at a time? Or do you have the stamina for both at once?" Something inside Elias snapped. The years of banked rage, of grief held in check, of quiet suffering, erupted in a single, violent movement. He was off the porch in 2 long strides. He reached up, grabbed Blevins by the front of his shirt, and ripped him from the saddle. Blevins hit the ground with a heavy thud. Before he could scramble up, Elias was on him. He hit him once, a closed fist to the jaw, with a sound like wet leather splitting. Blevins's head snapped back, and he lay still. Blood trickled from his mouth into the dirt. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. The ghost of another man, the man he had been before Martha, looked out from his eyes. He was terrifying. "If you ever come on my land again," Elias said, his voice a ragged whisper, "I will bury you where you stand." He turned and walked back to the cabin without a backward glance. Blevins stirred, spitting a mouthful of blood and a broken tooth onto the ground. He struggled to his feet, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. "This is not over! Cade!" he screamed after him. "You and your freaks are going to pay!" Then he staggered to his horse and rode off into the twilight. Inside the cabin, the stew sat untouched. The air was thick with the aftermath of the violence. Clara and Lorna had heard everything. Clara looked at Elias with a mixture of fear and awe. Lorna's expression was grimly familiar. She knew that kind of male rage. She had been on the receiving end of it for 10 years. But this was different. This had been rage in their defense. That night, sleep would not come. Elias lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, the phantom feeling of Blevin's jaw cracking against his knuckles still tingling in his hand. He had protected them, but he had also brought the wolf right to their door. He heard a soft footfall on the floorboards. A figure moved through the darkness, a pale shape in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was Clara. She stopped beside his cot. "Elias?" she whispered. He sat up, his heart beginning to pound. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice small but steady. "I was, for a moment, but not anymore." She knelt beside him. In the dim light, he could see the resolve in her eyes. She reached out and took his hand, the one he had used to strike Blevins, and brought it to her cheek. His hand was rough and calloused against her soft skin. "Lorna told me what it should feel like," she whispered. "She said it should feel like coming home." She guided his hand from her cheek and placed it over her heart. He could feel its frantic bird-like beat beneath his palm. "I want to come home, Elias." It was a surrender, but not a defeat. It was an offering, pure and freely given. He looked at her, at the trembling hope in her face, and the last of his resistance crumbled. He was not a wolf, and she was not a lamb. They were just 2 lonely people, reaching for each other in the dark. He drew her gently onto the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over them both. Their union was nothing like the desperate, frantic coupling in the barn. It was a quiet discovery, hesitant and tender. It was full of trembling breaths and whispered reassurances. He moved with a reverence he did not know he possessed, terrified of hurting her, of breaking this fragile, beautiful trust. For Clara, it was not an act of submission, but of claiming. She was claiming her own heart, her own body, and her own place in this strange, complicated world. Across the room, in the darkness, Lorna lay on her own cot, perfectly still, her eyes wide open. She listened to the soft sounds, the rustle of the blanket, the murmured words, the final, quiet sigh. She did not weep. She simply stared into the blackness, a solitary island in a sea of someone else's discovery. the echoes of her own past a silent, mournful counterpoint. In the morning, the sun streamed into the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elias awoke to find Clara curled against his side, her face peaceful in sleep. As the light touched her face, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears. A cold dread seized him. "Clara, did I hurt you?" She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her temple. She smiled, a wobbly, radiant smile. "No," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It is not for regret. It is because, for the first time in my life, I think someone has seen me, all of me, and I feel loved." Her simple, heartfelt words were a more profound blow than any fist. He had sought to protect her, yet it was she, with her quiet courage, who had saved him from his own solitude. Lorna was already gone when they rose. She had taken a bucket and headed out toward the fields, avoiding them both. For days, she kept her distance, a silent, brooding presence at the edge of their newfound intimacy. She was polite, but her eyes were shuttered, her thoughts a mystery. Elias felt her withdrawal like a constant, low-grade ache. He had found a fragile peace with Clara, but in doing so, he seemed to have lost something essential with Lorna. He finally followed her out into the fields one afternoon. She was standing on a small rise, looking out at the distant mountains, her back to him. "Lorna," he said, his voice quiet. She did not turn. "You made your choice. Elias, you do not need to explain it." "It was not a choice," he said, moving to stand beside her. "Not like that. I do not know what it was." "Do you not?" She finally turned to face him, and he was shocked to see the raw, naked pain in her eyes. Her composure had shattered. "You built her a room. Elias, you gave her a home in your bed. What is left for me? The barn? The floor? I have slept on floors before. I will not do it again." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. Soon, she was weeping, not with loud, histrionic sobs, but with the silent, wrenching despair of someone who had held herself together for too long. She broke down, her body trembling, and he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her grief pouring out of her. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his heart aching with a pain that was a mirror of her own. He had been so focused on Clara's fragility that he had forgotten Lorna's strength was born of immense suffering. He had handled her like she was unbreakable, forgetting that even the strongest trees can be shattered by the right storm. When her tears subsided, he tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his rough thumbs. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with a regret so profound it felt like it was tearing him apart. "I am so sorry." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate fire of the barn. It was not a kiss of hunger or need. It was quiet. It was reverent. It was full of the apology he could not put into words. It was a kiss that promised to stay, to stand with her, to see the scars and not turn away. It was a kiss of devotion, and in that moment, under the vast, uncaring sky, Elias Cade knew he was truly lost. He loved them both. The new room was finished, but the peace Elias had hoped to build with it never arrived. The raw pine walls smelled of sawdust and effort, but they could not keep the poison of the town from seeping in. The first official sign of trouble came in the form of Marshal Lynn Thompson, a weary man with a drooping mustache and the weight of keeping a fractious town in order etched into his face. He rode out one afternoon and did not dismount, sitting his horse by the new fence line as if afraid the very ground was contaminated. "Elias," he said, his voice low and devoid of accusation. "Folks are talking." Elias leaned on his axe, saying nothing. He knew what folks were talking about. "Walt Blevins has been stirring the pot," the marshal continued, nursing his jaw in a grudge. "But it is more than that. The preacher is up in arms. The women, they are getting nervous. It is not natural. They say, it is causing unrest. He sighed, shifting his weight in the saddle. I am not here to tell you how to live your life, but as the law in this county, I am telling you to be mindful. Trouble is brewing, and your household is at the center of the storm. The marshal's warning was an omen. The storm broke a few days later. Clara, needing thread to mend Elias's shirts, rode into town alone. It was an act of quiet courage, a step toward normalcy that was cruelly punished. As she stood at the counter in the general store, a group of women, led by the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, turned their backs on her, forming a silent, solid wall of condemnation. When Clara asked for her thread, Mrs. Gable looked through her as if she were a ghost. "We do not serve her kind here," one of the women said, loud enough for the entire store to hear. Clara's face burned with a shame so hot it brought tears to her eyes. She stood there for a long moment, isolated and humiliated, before turning and fleeing, the spools of thread forgotten on the counter. Lorna's trial was even more brutal. Driven by a need to defy the town's judgment, she had attended the Sunday service, sitting alone in the rearmost pew. She endured the stares and the whispers, her back straight, her expression a mask of indifference. But as the congregation filed out after the sermon, a pointed diatribe against vipers of sin hiding in plain sight, a man deliberately jostled her, and his wife, a woman whose face was a pinched knot of piety, spat on the floor at Lorna's feet. The glob of spittle on the dusty floorboards was a more profound violation than any blow. Lorna walked out of that church with her head held high, but Elias saw the tremor in her hands when she returned to the cabin. The town had drawn its battle lines. Elias felt a cold, murderous rage coiling in his gut. He was a man who knew how to solve problems with his hands, with a gun. But this was a different kind of fight, a war of whispers and poisoned glances that he did not know how to win. That night, as the three of them sat in a tense, wounded silence, he laid out his solution. "We are leaving," he said, his voice flat and final. "I have been up to the high valley, near the base of the mountain. There is good water, timber, pasture. It is a hard ride from town. No one will bother us there. We can start fresh." Clara's eyes lit up with a desperate hope. After the humiliation of the store, the thought of escape, of a place where she would not be judged, was like a promise of paradise. "Peace," she whispered, the word itself a prayer, even if it means hiding. But Lorna stiffened, her face hardening. "No," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I am done running. I ran from my husband's house. I ran from a town that wanted to see me hang. I will not be run out of this valley by a gaggle of gossiping hens and a preacher who smells of his own hypocrisy." She stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is our home. Are we to spend our whole lives looking over our shoulders, hiding from the world because it is too small to understand us?" "It is not about understanding," Clara retorted, her own voice rising with a passion that surprised them all. "It is about living. I want to wake up in the morning and not feel the weight of every eye in town on my back. I want to breathe air that does not taste of hate. What is the virtue in standing your ground if all it brings is misery?" The two women faced each other across the small cabin, their argument a clash of two different kinds of survival. One had been hunted all her life and yearned for a safe den. The other had been caged and now refused to be driven from the open field. Elias felt caught between them, two powerful currents threatening to tear him apart. He slammed his hand down on the rough-hewn table, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the small room. "Stop it!" he roared, his voice raw with a pain that went deeper than anger. They both fell silent, startled by his outburst. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders slumping. "Do you not think I know this?" he said, his voice muffled. "Do you not think I lie awake at night trying to figure out how to make this right?" He looked up, and the anguish in his eyes silenced any further argument. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the very root of his soul. He looked at Clara. I love your gentleness, your courage. You make me feel decent, like the man I was supposed to be. Then his gaze shifted to Lorna. And I love your fire, your strength. You make me feel alive, like the man I am. He let out a ragged breath. I love you both. God help me, I do, and I do not know how to make it right. I do not know how to build a world where a heart like mine is allowed to exist. His breakdown was a confession of helplessness, a surrender to the impossible truth of his own heart. The fight was over. The silence that remained was filled with a shared, aching sorrow. The world, however, was not done with them. The new threat did not come from town. It came from Lorna's past, a specter riding a dust-colored horse. Elias was out checking the fence line near the river when he saw the rider approaching, not from the direction of redemption, but from the west. The man was tall in the saddle, with a rifle slung across his back and a look of grim purpose about him. Elias felt a cold premonition, a hunter's instinct that this was not a friendly visitor. At the cabin, Lorna had gone to the well to draw water for the evening meal. She was hauling up the bucket when a shadow fell over her. She looked up and froze. The man stood not 10 feet away, his face a harsher, colder version of her dead husband's. A cruel smile touched his lips. Hello, sister, Jedediah Beckett said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. Been a long time. I heard you had come into some trouble. Thought I would ride out and offer my assistance. Lorna's blood ran cold. This was not her brother. This was her husband's brother, a bounty hunter and a man known for his cruelty. I do not need your help, Jedediah, she said, her voice steady despite the terror seizing her heart. Oh, I think you do, he said, taking a step closer. See, there is still the matter of my brother's untimely end. There is a reward posted in the next territory for the woman who murdered him. I am here to collect, to avenge my kin. He lunged, grabbing her arm in a punishing grip. You are coming with me. Lorna struggled, but he was too strong. He began to drag her away from the well, toward his horse. No, she screamed, her voice a raw cry of panic. The cabin door flew open. Clara stood there, her face white with terror. In her hands, she held Elias's heavy Spencer rifle. It trembled, the barrel wavering, but she held it. Let her go, Clara said, her voice a high, thin sound. Jedediah Beckett laughed, a dismissive, ugly sound. Put that down, little girl, before you hurt yourself. He gave Lorna a vicious shake. I said, let her go, Clara screamed, and this time her voice did not waver. She raised the rifle. The stock pressed awkwardly against her shoulder. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle's kick sent her stumbling backward. But the shot was true. It did not hit Jedediah. It whistled past his head, a deadly promise, and splintered the top rail of the fence behind him. He froze, his eyes wide with shock. In that moment of hesitation, he did not see Elias come sprinting from the tree line, his face a mask of murderous fury. Elias hit him like a runaway train, a single, silent, unstoppable force. The impact sent both men sprawling in the dirt. Elias was up first. He hauled Jedediah to his feet and hit him, a brutal, methodical series of blows that were not meant to subdue, but to destroy. He hit him until Jedediah's face was a bloody ruin, until he was a limp weight in Elias's hands. He drew back his fist for a final, finishing blow. But then he saw them. Clara, still holding the rifle, her face streaked with tears, and Lorna, huddled on the ground, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He stopped, his fist trembling inches from the unconscious man's face. With a great, shuddering gasp, he let Jedediah's body drop to the ground. He had spared him, but only just. He turned to the women, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. The violence drained out of him, leaving a vast, empty silence. He walked over to them, his legs unsteady. He knelt in the dirt between them, putting a hand on Clara's arm and another on Lorna's shoulder. They both flinched, but did not pull away.
"This is not about choosing," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. He looked from one to the other, his heart bare in his eyes. "This is about breathing. I am yours, both of you. The man who builds a room to keep you safe," he said to Clara. "And the man who would kill to protect you," he said to Lorna. "I breathe because of you." That night, the world felt different. The threat had been met, not by a single person, but by all of them. A boundary had been crossed. After they had cleaned their wounds and eaten in silence, they sat before the fire. The new room Elias had built stood empty. No one suggested using it. The space between them, once filled with tension and unspoken questions, was now filled with a fragile, profound understanding. When the fire burned down to glowing embers, Elias stood up. He did not go to his cot. He simply held out his hands. After a long moment, Clara took one, her fingers trembling slightly. Then Lorna took the other, her grip firm and sure. He led them to his cot, the largest of the three. They lay down, one on each side of him. The space crowded but not uncomfortable. It was not vulgar. It was sacred. The air was filled with the simple, profound reality of their shared breath. In the dim, flickering light from the hearth, Elias lay on his back, trembling between them, a bridge between two shores. Then, in the quiet darkness, Lorna reached across him. Her hand, calloused and strong, found Clara's. She did not just take it, she covered it, her fingers lacing through the younger woman's, a gesture of profound and radical acceptance, a promise, a pact. The widow touched the virgin, and in that simple, silent act, the war was over. They had stopped fighting the world, and they had stopped fighting each other. They had finally, completely, chosen one another. The journey to the High Valley was an exodus. They left behind the cabin that had been both prison and sanctuary, carrying only what was essential. They were shedding a skin, leaving the judgment and the whispers to fester in the lowlands. The valley welcomed them with a fierce, formidable beauty. It was a bowl of green cupped in the hands of granite mountains, threaded with a creek so clear it looked like liquid glass. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of wind through ancient pines. Here, the world felt new, unwritten. Elias chose a spot on a gentle slope, protected from the north wind by a thick stand of aspen. They set to work immediately, a silent, unified force against the wilderness. He felled the trees, his axe swinging with a tireless, rhythmic grace. The women worked alongside him, stripping the bark, dragging the smaller logs, their hands growing calloused, their faces browned by the sun. There was a grim satisfaction in the labor, in the building of something that was theirs from the ground up. The new cabin was larger than the old one, and built with more care. Elias constructed 2 rooms, a main living space and a smaller one off the side. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that they were not merely 3 bodies crammed into a single space, but 3 souls who might sometimes need the dignity of a closed door. But when it came time to build the beds, he built only one. It was a wide, sturdy platform, big enough for all 3 of them, a silent testament to the choice they had made that night by the fire. It was not a rejection of privacy, but an affirmation of their unity. 3 hearts, 1 home. Their isolation was not absolute. Word of their departure had traveled faster than they had. A month into their new life, a sheep herder passing through the low country brought them a copy of the Redemption Chronicle. On the 3rd page, in a column dedicated to local gossip and moralizing, was a small, ugly piece of text. It spoke of the infamous Cade household, which had fled from the decent folk of this town to establish a house of sin in the untamed wilderness. It called Elias a man of base appetites, Lorna a murderous Jezebel, and Clara a fallen dove. Lorna read it, her face impassive.
then crumpled the newsprint and tossed it into the fire. Watching the words blacken and turn to ash, Clara wept, not with the hot shame of her experience in the general store, but with a quiet, resigned sorrow for the world's ugliness. Elias simply stared at the fire, a muscle working in his jaw. The world had cast them as outlaws, and so outlaws they would be. They would build their own law, their own church, their own world on this patch of high ground. And so they settled into a life defined by seasons and survival. Elias worked the land with a ferocity that was part penance, part prayer. He was trying to outrun the ghosts of his first family, to build something so solid and real that it might keep the memories at bay. He cleared fields, built fences, and hunted for their meat, his days a long, hard testament of physical labor. He was trying to be the man they both needed, the protector and the provider, and the effort exhausted him in a way that left no room for the darkness to creep in at night. Lorna found her solace in the earth. She cultivated a sprawling vegetable garden, her hands, once marked by a cruel husband, now coaxing life from the soil. She planted neat rows of beans, squash, and corn, tending to the seedlings with a maternal fierceness. To watch her in the garden was to watch a woman reclaiming herself. Every weed she pulled was a resentment vanquished. Every vegetable she harvested was a victory against the starvation of her past. She was not just growing food. She was growing roots. Clara, in turn, found her voice in the quiet. She took over the running of the household, but her true work took place in the evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp. She wrote long, flowing letters to an estranged sister back in Ohio, a sister she had not spoken to in years. She did not write of the scandal or the town's judgment. Instead, she wrote of the beauty of the mountains, of the satisfaction of baking bread, of the color of the sky at sunset. She described Elias's quiet strength and Lorna's surprising tenderness. In writing it, she made it real. She was defining her life not by what others called it, but by what it truly was. Through her careful, looping script, she was transforming a story of sin into a story of survival and even of love. The summer was hot and dry. The creeks shrank, and the grass in the valley cured to a pale, brittle gold. For weeks, a haze of smoke from distant fires hung in the air, turning the sun into a hazy, orange ball. One night, they awoke to a terrifying sight. The entire southern ridge of the valley was glowing, a jagged line of orange against the black sky. The wind had shifted, and the wildfire was coming for them. Panic was a live thing in the air. Elias worked like a man possessed, soaking blankets in the creek, dousing the roof and walls of the cabin, while the women gathered their most essential supplies. The air grew thick and acrid, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. The roar of the approaching fire was a physical presence, a sound that vibrated deep in their bones. They retreated into the cabin as the fire descended into the valley. A rolling, monstrous wall of flame. Smoke poured through the cracks in the walls, thick and oily. Elias, his face black with soot, ordered them to lie on the floor, where the air was clearest. He stood by the door, a wet blanket wrapped around his face, ready to fight the embers that landed on their roof. The heat was unimaginable. The world outside their small shelter was an inferno. Clara began to cough, deep, racking coughs that shook her whole body. She was fading, her eyes fluttering, the smoke stealing her breath. Lorna, lying beside her, saw the danger. She crawled over to Clara, grabbing her by the arm. "We have to get out," she rasped, her own voice choked. "The smoke will kill us before the fire does." She began to drag Clara toward the door, her strength born of a desperate, protective love. "Elias," she screamed. He turned from the door, his eyes wild in his soot-blackened face. He saw Clara, limp and barely conscious, and Lorna, struggling to pull her through the suffocating smoke. He did not hesitate. He threw the door open to a blast of heat and a shower of embers. He grabbed both women, slinging Clara over one shoulder and half carrying, half dragging Lorna with his other arm. He plunged out of the cabin and ran.
Not toward the creek, but toward the large, rocky outcropping he had cleared a week earlier. A desperate, last-ditch firebreak. He made it to the bare dirt and rock and collapsed, dropping them both and falling to his knees in the ash. His lungs burning, his body screaming with effort. He had saved them. He had gotten them out. He lay there, gasping in the scorched air, as the fire raged around their small island of safety, consuming their fields, their fences, the very air they had breathed. They huddled together on the rock all night, watching the world burn. By dawn, the fire had passed, leaving behind a blackened, smoldering landscape. Their cabin, soaked and scarred, had miraculously survived. A lone, defiant structure in a sea of devastation. They were alive. They had lost nearly everything, but they were alive. As the first, weak light of morning filtered through the smoke, Clara, her voice a raw whisper, looked out at the ruin. "If the world burns," she said, her gaze finding first Lorna's, then Ellis's, "let it burn. We will still be here." In the aftermath of the fire, a new, deeper quiet settled over them. The shared trauma had burned away the last of their reservations, leaving only a raw, elemental bond. A week later, as they worked to salvage what they could from the garden, Lorna stopped, her hand pressed to her lower belly. She walked over to Elias, her face pale. "Elias," she said, her voice unsteady, "I am with child." He stared at her, the news failing to register for a moment. Then, a slow, dawning wonder spread across his face, but Lorna's expression was not joyful. It was terrified. "I do not know if I can carry it," she whispered, the old fears resurfacing. "My body, it has been through so much. I am not sure it remembers how to hold on to life." Before Elias could answer, Clara, who had overheard, let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She ran to Lorna, her face streaked with soot and tears, and threw her arms around her. "Oh, Lorna," she wept, her voice full of a pure, unadulterated joy that was breathtaking to witness. "Do not be afraid." She pulled back, her hands on Lorna's shoulders, her eyes shining. "Then let us raise the child together, all of us." The fear in Lorna's eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of hope. She looked from Clara's radiant face to Elias's stunned, tender one, and for the first time, the idea of a child felt less like a terror and more like a possibility. The nights grew cooler as autumn approached. They would sit outside after their work was done, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge in the clear, smoke-free sky. The constellations were brilliant in the high, thin air, a canopy of endless, silent light. They began to talk, telling stories of their lives before this one. Elias spoke of Martha and Samuel, not with the sharp, cutting pain of before, but with a gentle, wistful sorrow. Lorna spoke of her childhood, of a mother who loved to sing and a father who taught her the names of the stars, memories she had buried under the weight of her marriage. Clara spoke of her dreams, of a life where she was not owned, where her heart was her own to give. They traced the scars on each other's bodies, not with pity, but with a quiet reverence. The long, faded line on Elias's ribs from a forgotten fight, the small, circular burns on Lorna's back, souvenirs from her husband's cruelty, even the small, silvery mark on Clara's hand from a childhood cooking accident. They were a map of their survival, a history written on skin. They were learning a new softness with one another, a tenderness born of shared hardship and radical acceptance. One night, as Elias slept soundly between them, a deep, exhausted sleep, Clara lay awake, watching Lorna's profile in the starlight. Lorna's hand was resting protectively on her still flat belly. An overwhelming wave of love and a strange, poignant longing washed over Clara. She reached across Elias, her touch gentle on Lorna's arm. "Lorna?" she whispered. Lorna turned her head. "What is it?" "I wish," Clara began,
her voice trembling with the vulnerability of her confession. "Sometimes, I wish I could make you feel what he does. The pleasure, the peace. I wish I could give you that, too." The words were an offering of impossible intimacy. Lorna's breath hitched. She looked at this young woman, whose innocence she had once pitied, and saw a love so profound it defied every rule she had ever known. She saw a desire not for flesh, but for the healing of the soul. Lorna reached out, her hand covering Clara's where it rested on her arm. Then she shifted, moving closer, her body pressing against Elias's sleeping form to bridge the space between them. She brought her other arm around Clara, pulling her into a gentle, firm embrace. Clara melted into it, her head finding the hollow of Lorna's shoulder. They held each other like that. Two women in a bed with the man they both loved. Their embrace not for his sake, but for theirs. It was a love that was raw and protective, maternal and sensual. A feeling that blurred all the old lines and created something new. It was the fierce love of a mother for a child, a sister for a sister, a survivor for a fellow survivor. It was the quiet, profound love of a woman for a woman. For the first time, looking up at the endless, silent stars. All three of them, in their own way, truly and completely believed in a future. The first snows of winter found them in the high valley, dusting the blackened skeletons of the burned trees and blanketing the land in a clean, quiet white. The fire had taken much, but it had given something back, a stark clarity. The world had been burned down to its essentials: food, shelter, warmth, and each other. Lorna's pregnancy had advanced, her belly a gentle, promising curve beneath her dress. A fragile, fierce hope had taken root in their small, isolated world. They were a family, forged in fire and bound by a love that had no name. But the world below had not forgotten them. Trouble, when it came again, wore a badge and a self-righteous expression. The new sheriff was a young man, recently appointed, eager to impose the rigid lines of the law onto the messy canvas of the frontier. He was not like Marshal Thompson, a man who understood the gray spaces where people lived. This man saw only black and white, sinner and saint, legal and illegal. He rode up to their cabin with 2 deputies, his arrival a jarring intrusion into their hard-won peace. "Elias Cade?" the sheriff called out, his voice sharp and loud in the quiet air. Elias stepped out onto the porch, flanked by Clara and Lorna. The women stood slightly behind him, not in fear, but in solidarity. They were a single, unbroken line. "I am Sheriff Miller," the man announced. "I have a warrant for your arrest on the charge of polygamy, and another for harboring a fugitive." He nodded curtly toward Lorna. "A woman wanted for murder in the adjacent territory." Lorna's hand flew to her belly, a gesture of pure, protective instinct. Clara stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "There has been a mistake, Sheriff," she said. "We are not." "The law will decide what you are," Miller interrupted, his eyes cold. "Elias Cade, you will turn yourself in and come with us peacefully." Elias looked at the men, at their drawn pistols and their hard faces. He could fight. The instinct was there, a low growl in his soul. But he saw Clara's trembling lip and the stark terror in Lorna's eyes. And he knew violence would solve nothing. It would only bring more pain down upon their heads. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will come," he said. "There is no need for guns." That night, after the sheriff had left with Elias in tow, promising a trial in 2 weeks, the cabin felt vast and empty. The 2 women sat in a state of shock, the threat of their world being torn apart a cold presence in the room. It was Clara who broke the silence, her mind, always practical, searching for a solution, a way to make the world understand. "I will marry him," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. "Legally, we will go to the judge and I will become his wife. Then they cannot charge him with polygamy. It will fix things. You You could be my widowed sister, living with us for protection." Lorna looked at her, at the earnest, desperate hope in her eyes. She saw the girl's willingness to sacrifice her own truth, to squeeze their beautiful, complicated life into a shape the world would find acceptable. A fierce, protective love for Clara rose in her, so powerful it was painful. "No," Lorna said, her voice soft but unyielding. She reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "Look at me, Clara. We have run, we have hidden, we have survived. I will not lie anymore. Not for them." She squeezed Clara's hand, her gaze intense. "We are not hiding anymore. We will go down into that town and we will tell them the truth. All of it. Let them choke on it." The trial began in a cramped, stuffy courtroom that smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. The entire town of Redemption seemed to be crammed onto the hard wooden benches, their faces a sea of hostile curiosity. Elias stood before the judge, a visiting magistrate named Horace Blackwood, his hands bound in front of him. He looked tired but unbroken. Clara and Lorna sat in the front row, a small, isolated island in an ocean of contempt. The prosecution called its witnesses. Walt Blevins, his jaw still slightly crooked, took the stand and painted Elias as a violent, godless man who had lured innocent women into his den. Mrs. Gable followed, speaking in hushed, scandalized tones of Clara's shamelessness and Lorna's demonic presence. Finally, the preacher took the stand, thundering from the witness box as if it were his pulpit. He quoted scripture and spoke of the moral rot that such a household represented, a cancer that had to be cut out before it infected the entire community. The case against them was built on a foundation of rumor, prejudice, and fear. Elias said little in his own defense, answering the prosecutor's questions with a quiet, dignified reserve that only seemed to infuriate the crowd further. He would not defend his heart to men who had no capacity to understand it. When it was time for the defense to present its case, their court-appointed lawyer, a young man who clearly believed his client was guilty, had little to offer. It was then that Clara stood up. "I would like to speak," she said, her voice clear and steady in the stunned silence. Judge Blackwood, a man with weary, intelligent eyes, looked at her over his spectacles. "You are not on trial here, young lady." "My life is," Clara replied, "and I will not have it told by liars." She walked to the witness stand, clutching a small, leather-bound book in her hands, her diary. The crowd murmured, a low, hungry sound. This was what they had come for, the sordid details, the confession of a fallen woman. Clara was sworn in. She did not look at the prosecutor or the crowd. She looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling only slightly. "People here have said many things about me, about Mrs. Beckett, and about Mr. Cade. They have used words like harlot and sinner and pervert. They have built a story to suit their own fears, but they do not know our story. I would like to read it to you now." She opened the diary. The room was so quiet. The sound of a page turning was startlingly loud. She began to read, her voice growing stronger with every word. She read of her arrival, a terrified girl fleeing a cruel stepfather. She read of the blizzard, and of the gruff, silent man who had taken her in when he could have left her to die. "He does not speak much," she read, her voice gaining a melodic cadence. "But his hands are kind. He fixed the sole of my boot and never said a word about how worn it was. He brings me coffee in the morning before he goes to the barn. I think he is the loneliest man I have ever known." She read of Lorna's arrival, a broken woman collapsing in the snow. She described how they had nursed her back to health, how Elias had sat with her through the fevered nights. She read of her own jealousy, of her heartbreak in the barn, her words so pure and honest that the salaciousness the crowd had hoped for evaporated, replaced by a profound, uncomfortable empathy. "I did not understand what I saw," she read, her voice cracking with remembered pain. "I thought love was a gentle thing, a quiet thing. What I saw between them was a storm. It was two people holding on in a hurricane. It was not pretty, but it was true. And my heart hurt. Not because he had touched her, but because I had not understood that there are many kinds of hunger. She read on, her diary a chronicle of their lives in the High Valley. She spoke of the fire, of how Lorna had dragged her from the smoke-filled cabin, how Elias had carried them both to safety. She spoke of learning that Lorna was with child, and of the pure, fierce joy she had felt. She did not shrink from the truth of their life, of the one bed, of the love that bound the three of them together. "Last night," she read, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that filled the courtroom. "Lorna was afraid for the baby. I held her hand until she fell asleep. Elias had his arm around us both. I lay there in the dark, and I thought, this is my family. It is not the family the world says I should have. It is broken and strange and scarred, but it is built on truth. It is built on kindness. It is built on a love so real it makes my bones ache. If that is a sin, then I do not know what virtue is." She closed the book. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one moved. No one whispered. For the first time, the people of redemption had been forced to see not the monsters of their gossip, but three human beings, flawed and suffering, who had found a strange and beautiful salvation in one another. Clara walked back to her seat, her head held high, and sat down beside Lorna, who took her hand and held it tight. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat. He looked at Elias, then at the two women. He seemed to look at them for a very long time. "In my 20 years on the bench," he said finally, his voice heavy, "I have heard testimony of every kind of human depravity. I have seen what greed and cruelty can do to a man's soul, and I have seen what loneliness can do to a human heart." He looked out at the faces of the townsfolk. "This court finds insufficient evidence to proceed on the charge of murder against Mrs. Lorna Beckett." A gasp went through the crowd. "As for the charge of polygamy, the law is the law. It is a blunt instrument, and it does not always account for the complexities of the heart. Mr. Cade, you have broken the law of this territory." He paused, his gaze settling on Elias. "What you have built up there in that valley may not be legal," he said, his voice dropping. "But sitting here today, listening to this brave young woman, I cannot find it in my heart to call it evil." He banged his gavel once. "I am fining you $100 for your transgression, and I am ordering you and your family to leave this county and not return. This court is adjourned." They returned to the High Valley not in shame, but in a state of quiet triumph. They had faced the world and had not been destroyed. They were exiles, but they were free. They were changed, their bond now tempered in the fire of public trial, stronger and more resilient than ever before. 2 weeks later, as the first true blizzard of the season descended upon the valley, Lorna's labor began. It came on fast and hard, weeks before its time. There was no doctor, no midwife, only the three of them in the small cabin, with the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. It was a long, terrifying night. Elias, his face a mask of fear, held Lorna's hand, whispering encouragement, while Clara, following Lorna's strained instructions, did what needed to be done. Just before dawn, in the darkest, coldest hour of the night, the baby was born. She was terrifyingly small, her skin almost translucent, but she was alive. She let out a cry, not a weak, mewling sound, but a cry of shocking strength, a cry that filled the small cabin and fought back against the storm. A girl with her mother's stormy eyes and a shock of dark hair. She had strong lungs and an even stronger will to live. Clara cleaned her and wrapped her in the softest linen they had, her hands trembling with exhaustion and awe. She placed the baby in Lorna's arms. Lorna looked down at her daughter, tears of relief and love streaming down her face. And then she looked at Elias. He knelt beside the bed, his large, rough finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. He had lost a family to the whims of fate. Now, against all odds, he had been given another. "What will we name her?" Clara whispered. Elias looked at the tiny, perfect face, at the miracle of her breath in the cold air. He thought of the unmerited kindness he had been shown, of the beauty that had grown in the ugliest of circumstances, of the elegance and resilience of the two women beside him. "Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Grace." The seasons turned, the snows melted, and the valley was reborn, green and lush. Grace grew, a happy, healthy child, raised by 3 parents who adored her. The world below forgot about them. They were a strange local legend, a cautionary tale, but their reality was one of peace. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Clara sat in a rocking chair on the porch, rocking Grace, who was now a chubby, babbling toddler. In the yard, Lorna was chopping wood for the evening fire, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady, comforting heartbeat. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the land they had tamed, at the life they had wrested from it. He watched the 2 women he loved, and the child who was a symbol of their impossible union. This was not the life he had planned. It was harder, and stranger, and more beautiful than anything he could have ever imagined. "This is not the life they gave us," he whispered to the wind, a profound and quiet truth settling in his soul. "It is the one we built." They did not find peace in the world. They made peace within it. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.